In descending x exponents, you're going to have 5x cubed. Take the sign with the term, so minus 2x squared plus 5x plus 2. That's the division problem that I want you to solve. Find the quotient of that. Now, when we went back to this problem right here, the first thing you probably thought of is you said, does 58 go into 29? No. Does 58 go into 297? Yes. And then you asked yourself, what do I multiply 58 by to get 297? Is that correct? And in that process, did any of you think, what do I take 5 times to get 29 to come up with a possible value that might go in there? And 5 times 5 is 25. So let's see what 58 times 5 is. And it's 290, which works, correct? But you're asking yourself, what do I take 58 times to get close to 297 or to get 297 but not go over? So when you were asked this problem right here, you're asking yourself, what do I take x times to get 5x cubed? 5 what? X squared. If I multiply by 5x squared. Now what you were doing when we talked about coming over here and taking 58 times 5, I took 5 times both digits, right? When I talk about this process, what you're doing is you're multiplying 5x squared times this number out in front. That number just has 2 terms. So I need to take 5x squared and I have to multiply by x minus 4. Which says you do what property? Distributive property. And if you do the distributive property, you're going to get 5x cubed minus 20x squared. Do you agree with that? So just like over here, when you take 5 times 58, we take 5 times 58, and that gives you that number right there. What's the next thing you do in long division? You subtract. Do I just subtract the 2's? No, I subtract every single digit, right? I take 7 minus 0, I take 9 minus 9, and I take 2 minus 2. We subtract that whole number. What we want to do as the next step here is we want to subtract that whole quantity. If you subtract that whole quantity, what happens right here? It turns into a plus. So basically this next step is the same thing as changing your signs. I want to subtract that quantity, which means this becomes a negative right here, and this turns into a positive. Now if you group them together, negative 2x squared plus 20x squared is 18x squared. Or you could say minus negative 20x squared. What's 5x cubed minus 5x cubed? 0, those cancel. At negative, this is negative 2x squared. And then what you are doing, this is what you're doing in that column. In that column, you have this. You have negative 2x squared. And then what you are doing is you have to subtract. You have to subtract negative 20x squared. What happens when you subtract that negative 20x squared? It means you add it. So then you get this, negative 2x squared plus 20x squared. What does that give you? 18x squared. So this value, that's the tricky part, is right here. This right there comes from this right here. That's what you're doing. I'm just doing it in a vertical format. You're subtracting those values. In elimination, we were adding them, but now I want to subtract them. And when you subtract them, that means you got to change those signs. The next thing we have then, after you did that step, then what did you do? After I subtracted and got a 7 here, I had to bring down the next value. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to bring down this next value. Now you can bring down all of the values that remain if you want. You can bring down the next one because eventually there might be a time where this doesn't actually line up or cancel. So now you need to ask yourself, what do I multiply x by to get 18x squared? You take it times 18x. But what do you have to put there? You got to make sure that you take 18x times this value here. That's what I did before. I took 1 times 58. I'd take 3 times 58. You multiply these two together to get what goes underneath. So I got to do the same thing here. I have to take 18x times this value of x minus 4. What do you get when you multiply that?
You get 18x squared minus 17x.
But what's the next step you do after you multiply? You subtract. When you subtract, what's that do to your signs? What happens when I subtract negative 72?
Positive.
It turns into positive 72, and then I subtract positive 18, makes it a negative 18. So what happens? Those cancel, and you end up with 77x plus 2. Now you got to ask yourself, what do I take x times to get 77x? 77. And if I multiply by 77, you have to use the distributive property. That gives you 77x, and then what's 77 times 4? 308. Oops, I missed a sign, sorry. Now what do you do to those values? Subtract. If you subtract, that's the same thing as changing the signs, right? So this becomes a positive 308. So what are you left with? These cancel. And you are left with 310? Now what do we do at the very end? When you have a remainder, what do you take x times to get 310? You can't. That gives you 310x. So this has an x in it, this no longer has an x. So therefore, this is a remainder. And we talked about how to write your remainder is you write it as a fraction. 310 over x minus 4. That's the quotient when you take 5x cubed minus 2x squared plus 5x plus 2 and divide by x minus 4. Now, one thing we could do when we go back to this problem, how could you check yourself? Multiply. You would take this value right here, right? Times this, and then do what? Then you would add 52? Because that was your remainder, right?
Yeah.
All right. Here's what we can do here. We have to multiply these two values together to check ourselves. Oh, that gets into what we talked about yesterday. All right, if I multiply those two values together, here's my problem is I'm going to run into, I got to slide my screen down. Oh, perfect. I didn't think those would group together, but they did. Oh, it just did the circle. Well, that's a bummer. Does somebody have that written down?
Yeah.
Okay, because I need to go to another. We got to check ourselves. So we need to multiply them together. So what were the values? The value out in front was x minus 4. What was our quotient? So here's what you have to do. I'm going to take 5x squared times this quantity. I'm not going to distribute it yet. I'm going to just show it as that right there. Okay. And then I'm going to have to do it right here with this 18x. I got to multiply times this. And then I'm going to have to take my 77 times this value. And then I'm going to take this times that value. So I'm going to have 310 over x minus 4, and I'm going to multiply by x minus 4. All right, what happens when you use the distributive property? Okay, and if I multiply the blue through, you get
18x squared.
okay, then we're going to multiply the 77 through to give you 77x minus 308. And then what happens here? What happens here? The x minus 4 cancels and you are left with 310. Agree with that so far? Now what happens when you group like terms together? What are you going to get? You get 5x cubed minus 2x squared plus 5x plus 2. This right here should be the number or should be the value underneath the division sign, right? Because when I go back, and if I were to take these two and multiply them together, I should get that number right there. So if I multiply these two together, I should get 5x cubed minus 2x squared plus 5x plus 2. What did we get? 5x cubed minus 2x squared plus 5x plus 2. So is that the answer? Yes, that is the quotient.
Wait, that's the answer?
No,
No, the one above.
your answer was
Yeah. Okay.
this right here. So that right there should be your answer. This is the quotient. They're asking you for the quotient. And it will be 5x squared plus 18x plus 77 plus 310 over x minus 4. To get 72, 18 times 4. Same process as the other one. It's the same process as the long division we all dislike. But how many steps are there? It's kind of 3. What do you multiply by? Multiply it and subtract. You ask yourself, what do you multiply by? Multiply it and subtract. Oh, bring down the next value. What do you multiply by? Multiply it, subtract. What do I multiply by? Multiply it out and subtract. It's that same process over and over and over and over again. That ought to make you want to come back to class.